Over the last couple of days, we've had a lot of interviews come out for Dragon's Dogma 2 Dark Arisen. Most of those have been on Japanese-only websites. I did go over some of those interviews using AI to translate them, but you do tend to lose a little bit of context there. However, I did come across this one from Automaton West, and we're going to be going over it this video, and I'm going to be telling guys my thoughts on pretty much everything that is discussed during the interview itself. There's a lot of new information here in regards to what we can expect from Dark Arisen, so sit back, get a drink, get some snacks, and let's talk about everything. So the article starts us off by saying Dragon's Dogma 2 Dark Arisen adds 25 plus hours of content after nearly 2 years in development. We talked to the devs about how the expansion came to be. So a very important thing is whenever they are saying here that there's 25 plus hours of content, it is important to bring in the context that in a lot of other interviews, and I believe that in this one as well, the developers mentioned that, well, in the base game you had about 30 to 40 hours of content, which, if you actually played Dragon's Dogma 2, that is barely the critical path. That is rushing through the critical path if you already know what you are doing, because if you actually just want to explore and breathe in the game, I personally have 197 hours in Dragon's Dogma 2, and I still feel like I didn't do everything there was to do in that game. And the thing is, some of those hours are probably something that I played a little bit earlier so that I could give you guys my opinions before the game actually came out. I forget if it was like 20 or 30 hours, but even still, even if we take let's say if we take 50 hours, which I don't think I played 50 hours before the game came out. I don't really remember. It's been like a couple of years, obviously. But even if it was 50 hours, that means that we got at least 140 hours out of the base game throughout our live streams and all that good stuff. And it was just an absolute blast. So do take that in mind when they're saying 25 hours of content. I imagine that for a lot of players that actually enjoy exploring the world of Dragon's Dogma 2, there's going to be quite a bit more of that, especially when you take into account some of the elements that we're going to be talking about, which is what they call the hack and slash elements, which is another Japanese thing that when they start talking about hack and slash, for a lot of us in the West, you're like, hack and slash? I mean, kind of like Dynasty Warriors? No, hack and slash to them is kind of like Diablo. It means the loot grind of a Diablo game. So there's still going to be some loot grinding when it comes to Dark Arisen through the form of like the spoils and all of that stuff that we've talked about in previous videos, but we'll get into it some more in here as well. So they talk about how they've had the opportunity to interview the development team behind Dragon's Dogma 2 Dark Arisen, and they got to interview Kento Kinoshita, who is the director for Dragon's Dogma 2 Dark Arisen. He was also involved in the development of Dragon's Dogma 2, a multitude of Monster Hunter games. We talked about this in my other video as well. And he was also the director of Dragon's Dogma Online, which is quite interesting indeed. And he was also the director of the original Dark Arisen. So not the base Dragon's Dogma, but Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen, because the previous expansion to the Dragon's Dogma that came before Dragon's Dogma 2 was also called Dark Arisen, which, as you can imagine, was there was no shortness of confusion for a lot of us that actually played the original game. And he also got to interview Naoto Hoyama, who is the, I believe, producer. Yeah, producer Naoto Hoyama. Thank you for having us. So they go on to say, we saw a trailer for the game during Capcom Spotlight in June 26, but could you tell us what led to the development of Dragon's Dogma 2 Dark Arisen and what its core concepts are? Oyama says, for roughly 6 months after Dragon's Dogma 2 launched, we implemented various improvements and new features of the game through subsequent updates. After that, we received feedback from players saying things like, I want to spend more time in this world. I want to keep playing this game. I would imagine that if you read the feedback that we had in the West, it was more like, we want more monsters, and fast travel is annoying as hell. Because I do remember a lot of those discussions about fast travel. It was actually very frustrating because I enjoyed the game the way that it was. I didn't really feel like I needed better fast travel, but I know that a lot of players wanted that, so it is what it is. As Director Kinoshita mentioned in today's Capcom Spotlight's presentation, the project's concept is to deliver new adventures in Dragon's Dogma 2 filled with things players have yet to see, while offering higher playability and accessibility. That means the project has been in development for quite a long time now. Yes, we've been working on it for just under 2 years. Now, personally, when I read this part, I'm left wondering, is 2 years really enough to bring a meaningful expansion to Dragon's Dogma 2? Because I feel like there's so much to work on when it comes to this particular franchise and some of the shortcomings that we had with Dragon's Dogma 2 that I'm not sure that 2 years may be enough, but I guess we'll find out when the actual game comes out, so we'll see what happens. Dragon's Dogma 2, the Dark Arisen expansion, is actually going to be one of the most important things to come out for Capcom because of the performance issues. This is not in the interview, by the way. This is just like a personal point that I wanted to make. because of the performance issues that we had with Dragon's Dogma 2 and Monster Hunter Wilds. Dragon's Dogma 2 Dark Arisen absolutely needs to deliver in spades when it comes to performance, especially because it's also coming out on the Switch too, which we'll talk about. But more on that in the future. So, Kinoshita then follows up saying, after Dragon's Dogma 2 launch, we received all sorts of feedback from players, and we felt that addressing those concerns needed to come first. So for the first 6 months after release, we continued making improvements, using players' voices as both motivation and a means to reflect, while also thinking about what should come next for the game. As a result, our efforts were primarily focused on title updates during that period. Could you tell us about Dragon's Dogma 2 Dark Arisen overall scope? Roughly how long will it take to complete in a single playthrough? Will there be any replayable endgame content? The new story takes place in a new region called Norgan. We expect players to spend around 15 to 20 hours completing that scenario, so this is just the Norgan portion of the game. In addition, we have 12 unique dungeons, which will be added to the base game. Each dungeon is designed to take roughly 30 minutes to an hour to clear. With 12 of them in total, we believe players will be able to enjoy more than 25 hours of additional content this expansion. And this is where they then go on to expand on it and say the base game itself offers around 30 to 40 hours. 30 to 40 hours of gameplay. No, in my opinion, no. There's quite a lot more to do than 30 to 40 hours, but it's like if you just want to beeline through the main quest, I guess maybe you'll only get 40 hours out of it. But anyways, he says, so players who purchase both titles for the first time will get a substantial experience. So what he's saying is like, 65 plus hours if you start fresh with the game. During the Capcom Spotlight, you emphasized a replayable hack-and-slash gameplay loop. Does that apply to both the new story and the dungeon challenges? So again, this is where that context comes in, which is replayable hack-and-slash to them is the loot chase that you get from a game like Diablo. It's not really just like, hack-and-slash like Dynasty Warriors. Think more Diablo loot chase. That's what they mean by that, because you're going to be identifying the spoil items, and those items are going to come with randomly generated stats. Well, not randomly generated like Diablo, but more, stats appropriate to Dragon's Dogma, but they are going to be random. So if you want to chase for the best of the best of the best item, there's going to be quite a bit of grinding to be done. Now, Oyama goes on to say the hack and slash like elements are exclusive to the new area, Norgan. There, players can collect and appraise items known as relics, which yield stronger weapons, armor, and skills. The core gameplay loop consists of using those rewards to progress through the new story content. Now, these skills, there's also new custom skills that you're going to be adding, so brand new skills that we haven't seen for any of the classes, at least according to some of the interviews that I've been seeing, as well as upgraded versions of existing skills. And the way that it works is the weapons themselves will have the modifier that says, okay, so your skill A is now skill A plus, and that means that the skill now likely deals more damage or has an extra effect or has an extra animation added to it. Like, the upgraded skills of the original Dark Arisen for Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen were absolutely insane sometimes. You get like a whole new charge level to a spell, and the spell just became way more devastating, but at the cost of, taking longer to charge. So there were a lot of very, very interesting interactions with that. So we'll see if that is something that they plan on doing for this as well. Now, you've mentioned higher accessibility too. The game's base updates so far have already introduced some substantial quality of life changes, but can you tell us about the new improvements and what kind of feedback influenced them? Kinoshita says, we gradually realized that certain choices we made, which were intended to enhance the game's sense of a realistic adventure, ended up being perceived as inconveniences by players. Now, this is actually something that I'm a little bit concerned with, because this is one of those things where I liked the realistic traveling. I know that a lot of players didn't like it. It is what it is. I disagree. I was just like, I like ox carts getting invaded. I wish there was a bigger diversity to the events that can happen in ox cart, because usually it's just like, oh, monster shows up, destroys the ox cart. Like, I don't see this as a disadvantage. It's a chance to have like a different adventure. It's just a part of your adventure that you were traveling in this ox cart and it got destroyed. I actually thought that was kind of neat. Now, they are going to change the way that works. I don't know if they mentioned that in this interview, but there's going to be a new pawn that has like the guardian inclination, and that is going to prevent this happening. So to me, the theory is like, okay, so this pawn can like detect threats, so it kind of like warns the dude in the ox cart, and so the dude in the ox cart makes sure that he takes a route that either avoids the monster or he waits a little bit so that the monster goes through, and yada, yada, yada. Basically, I look at it as kind of like, okay, your pawn becomes kind of like a scout. So he scouts out when monsters are coming, and you can kind of like avoid that. So that is one of the things that can happen. But me personally, I've always enjoyed it. I thought that it was fun. I thought that it was cool to roam around the world and actually find dungeons. I would usually go through different paths when I was going to whenever I was traveling between cities, I'd be like, okay, so this time we're going to go through the right. We're going to travel along the mountainside to the right, see what happens. This time we're going to go through the left. We're going to travel close to the water, see what happens there. This time we'll take the main road, see what happens there. And I would just try to explore as much of the map as I was going through traveling. And I thought that was cool. And I just don't want the game to become one of those things where it's like, anytime I need to move, Eternal Fairy Stone, here we go. Because, I don't know, I feel like you do lose something with that. But I do know that for a majority of players, this is something that you guys want, so there you go. Anyway, Kanashita says, as a result, the post-launch updates focus on giving players more options so they can enjoy the game for longer. With Dark Arisen, we are planning things so that players can enjoy both those expanded ways of playing and the new content together. You've already rolled out improvements related to traversal, while August's update is set to make adjustments to action mechanics. What issues are you addressing there? Kinoshita says, the most significant piece of feedback we received was that there weren't enough custom skill slots. Yes! More custom skill slots is something that we've always wanted in Dragon's Dogma, mostly because when you're playing the game, a lot of times you're building up your character, you're setting up everything. Then when it comes to choosing the active skills that you're going to be using, you're like, oh man, I really wish I could use this fun skill, but I need to use this more useful skill for dealing damage. And so you end up not taking the more fun skill in favor of taking the more efficient skill. So even just having 2 additional skill slots is going to let us bring in some of those more fun skills. And I think it's going to be really, really interesting how that's going to work out. And I can't wait to jump in the game in August to check how that stuff's going to work. But then he says we plan to expand them. We also found that being surrounded and repeatedly attacked by smaller enemies could leave players trapped and left with no way to move until their health was completely depleted, causing frustration. These were 2 areas we determined needed major improvements. Skill issue. Anyway, the original Dragon's Dogma's expansion was likewise titled Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen. Why did you choose to reuse that title? Did you consider any other options? Oyama-san said, we didn't actually start development with the title Dark Arisen already decided. We first discussed what sort of content we wanted to create based on player feedback. Only after the project had taken shape did we decide to adopt that name officially. There are 3 main reasons we chose Dark Arisen. The first is its affinity with the story. So the story of the original Dark Arisen was about an Arisen that tried breaking the cycle, because the story of Dragon's Dogma in general is always about trying to break the cycle in different ways. And the story of Dark Arisen specifically, what I can remember of it, because it's been a very, very long time, was like a pawn that broke the cycle in a very unhealthy way, and that caused them to kind of like become corrupted, and everything around became corrupted. The stasis of the cycle not continuing corrupted loads and loads of stuff, and that was kind of like the story. So I would imagine that for Dark Arisen in Dragon's Dogma 2, it's going to be something along those lines. Likely one of the reasons why there's so many blizzards in that area. I'm sure that the weather itself is going to have a role to play and all of that, but yeah. First, its affinity with the story. Although we weren't consciously designing the game around that title, we ended up realizing that the narrative we wanted to tell aligned extremely well with the phrase Dark Arisen. The second reason is the hack and slash elements we mentioned earlier. The gameplay loop resembles that of the original Dark Arisen in that players fight enemies, collect powerful appraised items, strengthen themselves, and progress. When we considered how best to communicate both the new story and action, we felt that Dark Arisen was the most familiar choice. We believe players will find it easier to embrace and to remember. So again, it is that hack and slash gameplay loop that we talked about earlier, which was also present in the original Dark Arisen, because you already had the spoil items that you would go and you would identify, and they would also like upgrade your character immensely. So that was pretty cool. Continuing onward, so you also kept longtime fans of the original Dragon's Dogma in mind, Kinoshita. The circumstances were similar back to when the first Dark Arisen was created. Players who enjoyed the original Dragon's Dogma told us they wanted to spend more time in its world and continue enjoying its combat. Combat is, without a shadow of doubt, one of Dragon's Dogma's highlights. It's always been. The combat is incredibly satisfying and it is quite unique. There's not a lot of games that have combat like Dragon's Dogma, climbing up to monsters, doing crazy spell casting. As a matter of fact, I would say that no other game has the spell casting of Dragon's Dogma. It's some of the most impactful spell casting you can have in pretty much any video game, which is absolutely insane. Anyways, he continues, looking back on this project, we felt the same level of enthusiasm from players once again, which made us think we should create content that would allow them to enjoy the game even more, particularly through combat. So there's going to be a high emphasis on improving the combat. As Oyama said, taking the story's themes into account as well, we felt that using Dark Arisen subtitle again would evoke nostalgia among players familiar with the first game and make it easier to remember. So nostalgia, story themes, similar gameplay loops. So the region of Norgan is going to feel somewhat like Bitter Black Isle, I would imagine, which is quite interesting. Also, in regards to a question that I had brought up earlier when we were discussing this throughout live streams and whatnot, there was the topic of how do we actually gain access to the new continent of Norgan? And if you are not in the Unmoored world, which is like the end game kind of Dragon's Dogma 2, you can just go there. There's going to be an NPC in Vermont that will let you just go ahead and go to the place. However, if you are in the Unmoored world, the developers said you will sleep 10 times. I'm not exactly sure what happens when you sleep 10 times. I guess the fog just kind of like closes in the Unmoored world, forces you to the final encounter. Because basically I didn't sleep when I got to the Unmoored world. I was just like, nope, we're going through the whole damn thing without sleeping so that nothing bad happens, so that we can get like the best possible ending and save as many people as we possibly can. That is the way that I chose to do it. But basically, I guess that the idea is if you are already in the Unmoored world, the way to jump into the new content is going to be the jump into the New Game Plus. But yeah, anyways, Kinoshita, you've also worked on Dragon's Dogma Online. Did your experience from there influence the expansion in any way? And he goes on to say, I think Dragon's Dogma 2 fundamentally differs from the online version as a gaming experience, and I deliberately kept those separate in my mind. With Dragon's Dogma Online, our focus was on creating a world where all Arisen could gather and enjoy themselves together. This time, however, the core experience is adventuring alongside your pawns. See, I wouldn't know anything about what it was like to play Dragon's Dogma Online because we never got it in the West. Which is something that I was very frustrated with because I think that most Dragon's Dogma players, the players of the original Dragon's Dogma, we've always said that like, man, this game would be amazing in co-op. And then they released an online version of it only in Japan. And us in the West, we never got it. Anyway, he then goes on to say, because Dark Arisen for Dragon's Dogma 2 is designed as an extension, my thinking centered on what that experience should become, so I wasn't especially conscious of the online version during development. I'd like to talk about the game's difficulty. In the previous Dark Arisen, much of the expansion content was quite challenging unless players had already finished the base game. How difficult are the story and dungeons this time around, and what level or degree of progression is recommended? Well, I'll say, if you guys didn't know, in the original Dark Arisen, when you got the Bitter Black Isle, you straight up had death chasing after you. It could randomly spawn and would just kill you, and there was not much that you can do. You could get yourself powerful to a point where you would be able to defeat death, but it was quite hard. And whenever death came rolling around, you knew it's time to change floors, otherwise I'm gonna die. Anyway, Kinoshita goes on to say, the recommended level for entering the new region Norgan is 40. Now, I actually checked what level my save file was, which is the save file that I have at endgame. My character is level 80. He says, the dungeon content added to the base game is designed to be accessible from level 20. Hearing that, players who are just starting Dragon's Dogma 2 might feel overwhelmed by the prospect of having to reach level 40. However, by the time they arrive at the first capital city after starting the game, they should already be around level 8 or 10. Completing a few quests there will quickly bring them to level 20, making them strong enough to tackle the opening sections of the 12 new dungeons known as the Lost Rites. It is important to mention that 20 is like the weakest of the Lost Rites dungeon, and that they scale up the harder they become. So it's like you start at 20, but then you're expected to be higher level as you go to the next ones. Completing a few quests there will quickly bring them to 20, making them strong enough to tackle the opening sections of 12 new dungeons known as Lost Rites. Those dungeons also allow players to level up quickly and obtain weapons and armor that are stronger than usual. So for players eager to experience the new content as quickly as possible, one option is to reach level 20 and use the 12 dungeons as a means of character progression. On the other hand, players who have already spent a great deal of time with Dragon's Dogma 2's main story may be well beyond level 40 already. Like me. Those players will be able to enter Norgan and begin its adventure immediately. Even in such cases, the gameplay loop revolves around gathering randomized weapons and armor called relics, so we've designed it to provide a satisfying challenge. On that note, this is by Oyama. Norgan itself becomes accessible fairly early in the story. Players will be able to accept the quest as soon as they arrive in Vernworth, meaning they can attempt it surprisingly early if they wish. As for the Lost Rites, only the early portions are intended for players around 20. The later sections offer much tougher challenges aimed at higher level characters. At the same time, players can use the experience bonuses and other benefits from the 12 dungeons to make progressing through the main game easier as well. This whole thing, from what I could tell by looking at some of the other interviews as well as this interview, seems to me like the idea behind Dragon's Dogma 2 Dark Arisen is to have a more fleshed out Dragon's Dogma 2 as a whole, as opposed to just like this expansion. So it's not like the expansion makes the rest of the game kind of like obsolete. It is more so they designed this to be a complement to the game itself. And it feels like it's more designed for you to have a fresh playthrough, which to me just kind of screams out potentially New Game Plus. Perfect opportunity to do this New Game Plus. The biggest issue is that things currently don't really scale in New Game Plus. And I think that they talk about that a little bit further ahead. But if they don't, I'll bring it up from stuff that I've seen in other interviews as well. So they go on to ask, I imagine there are players who have already maxed out their characters. Is there any system that scales enemy strength based on the player's level? Yeah, this is exactly what I was talking about. Kinoshita says, we haven't implemented a system where enemy strength scales in proportion to the player's level. Features like that tend to be somewhat polarizing among players. Yeah, a lot of players prefer to be able to overlevel the content should they choose to do so, whereas other players like that the content scales with them. I can see both angles of that argument, and I don't necessarily lean towards one or the other. It depends on the game. But basically, I always want enemies to be challenging is usually the way that I go. But sometimes when they just scale to your level, things can get wonky pretty fast. So yeah. Anyways, they go on to say, that said, we are currently considering adding a hard mode for veteran adventurers who want a more intense challenge. We've been aware since Dragon's Dogma 2 launch that players have been asking for something along those lines, so we're carefully considering how best to approach the matter within the context of Dark Arisen. See, this is kind of weird because during some of the updates that Dragon's Dogma got, some of the post-launch updates, what they've actually released was an easy mode. Which a lot of us that had finished the game at that point, I remember talking to other friends of mine that had played the game and we were all like, an easy mode? We wanted the opposite, because when you get the New Game Plus, you just like one tap most monsters and the game doesn't really make a lot of sense anymore. What we wanted was more challenge, not make things easier. It was weird when the easy mode was announced for a lot of us. We were just like, well, what do you mean? I wanted more, not less. This is weird. But yeah, it's good to know that they're considering it, but some of the language that they've spoke about in some of these other interviews that I went through, it seemed like this mode has not been hard confirmed. So it's like they're considering it. Even if you read in this one, they said, that said, we are currently considering adding a hard mode, but it's not confirmed. I really hope they add a hard mode, because basically my decision making at this point in time is like, okay, if there's a hard mode, I'm going to grab my existing save, switch that over to hard mode and play through, you know, the entire game like that. Because I'm somewhere in New Game Plus at the very beginning of the game. So that would just be perfect. I'll just do New Game Plus, hard mode with my already built up character, my already built up pawn, and see how hard things actually get. On the other hand, if they do not add a hard mode, most likely I'm going to make a fresh save and go through the whole game all over again when the expansion comes out. So it's going to be a bit of a mixed bag with what we get. We're going to be playing, you know, the whole thing coupled together with the progression of the new dungeons and all of that stuff. So that's some of the consideration that I'm making right now. But anyways, yeah, we've been aware since Dragon's Dogma 2 launch, players have been asking something along those lines, so we're carefully considering how to best approach the matter within the context of Dark Arisen. The original Dark Arisen was set in the more confined dungeon area of Bitterblack Isle. Should we think of this game's new region, Norgan, as an expanded version of that concept? What advantages did making it an open field bring? Kinoshita says, I think that with the original Dark Arisen, we succeeded in creating a specific kind of hack and slash dungeon crawling. Again, keep in mind the notion of hack and slash is kind of like Diablo loot. However, simply offering more of the same thing again wouldn't have provided players with anything new or surprising. This time we wanted to pull off a design where players could enjoy hack and slash gameplay within the open field, gradually expanding the explorable area as they progress through the story. So it seems like portions of the map is going to be closed off and you're going to be opening that up as you play through the game. We'll see how that works. One advantage of switching to an open field is the sheer size of the map. Because the area is much larger, we're able to offer side quests in addition to the main story quests. Could you tell us anything about Norgan's setting or the monsters that inhabit it? Kinoshita says, the base game takes place on the continent where regions like Vernworth and Batal are located, but the premise here is that farther to the north, there exists a little-known territory that once flourished. Long ago, it appears to have enjoyed active trade and travel, much like Vermund. However, the harsh conditions of the far north, along with some of the other calamity whose details have since been lost, ultimately led to its downfall. When strange phenomena begin occurring in the supposedly lost land, the Arisen sets out to uncover the mysteries surrounding it. If it's fallen land, does that mean there aren't even any settlements left? Kinoshita, at least within the game world, that's how the region is perceived. We saw snow-covered areas in the trailer. Does the snow depth vary depending on the specific spot? Kinoshita says, the areas at the foot of the mountains aren't entirely buried in snow, but as you venture deeper into the region, everything becomes enveloped in snow, and there are places where blizzards never cease, creating a sense of variety and progression. As players continue onward, they'll also begin to encounter increasingly unmistakable signs that something is wrong. This is where I feel we're going to be seeing the signs of like the influence of the Dark Arisen, so think stasis, corruption, that type of stuff. However, one of the things concerns me, because like whenever I hear the words blizzards that never cease, my mind just goes to Frozen Outskirts and Dark Souls 2. Never again, bro. Never, ever, ever again. An area where everything is just white, eternal blizzard, you can't see crap, and there's enemies coming out of the blizzard attacking you, can't even lock onto them, absolute and abject misery. Never again. Please, whatever you do, do not do that. They then go on to say, one of the appeals of the Dragon's Dogma series has always been vast landscapes. Will Norgan also feature scenic views, or is it such a dangerous place that players won't have time to admire the scenery? Kinoshita goes on to say, he laughs, first of all, and then he says, there are definitely scenic spots. The region and its story progression are designed around gradually ascending from the foothills into higher elevations, so when players turn around after reaching a high point, I expect they'll discover spectacular views. So it is going to be very much open field, open world gaming. Oyama says, we've also designed the game so that points of interest are embedded into the landscapes. For example, you might notice something intriguing in the distant scenery and decide to head toward it, only to discover that doing so advances the story. I think players who take the time to really observe their surroundings will feel a stronger sense of immersion and a real feel of going on an adventure. You've also announced the expanded character customization options, and the pre-order bonus description mentioning dress up caught my eye. So this is the new layered armor system. So basically, if you've ever played a Monster Hunter game or even World of Warcraft with its transmog system, it's kind of the same thing. Pretty much any armor that you collect, from what I can tell from their descriptions that I've seen so far in other interviews, pretty much any armor that you collect is something that can be used as layered armor. So you can make your character look however you want to, regardless of which armor you actually have equipped. Which I'm not the biggest fan of these types of systems. I've talked about it multiple times. I think it's fun that what your character is wearing actually represents the content that you're doing. But for players that like engaging with that stuff, I'm sure that'll be fine. I do also tend to engage with it because it's like, hey, to me, if you design the layered system, that means that you're going to take less care into actually making armor pieces look coherent, because that's the way that I usually find most games that implement the layered armor system work. Whereas I just prefer if you just like design armor pieces to be coherent between themselves without necessarily needing the layered system, but it's not really a big deal. And then he says, are you perhaps considering a feature similar to Dragon's Dogma Online where players could change their appearance while retaining their equipment stats? Oyama says, yes, players will be able to experience something along those lines once they reach Norgan. Okay, so this system only unlocks when you reach Norgan. Will there be any unlock requirements? Kinoshita, we can't share the details yet, but there will be gameplay elements tied to unlocking it. Hack and slash mechanics are returning from the original Dark Arisen, but quite a lot of time has passed since then. Did you and the team draw inspiration from modern trends in the genre or from systems and other Capcom games during development? Kinoshita says, there are games like Diablo that I continue to play almost as a lifelong hobby. Hopefully not Diablo 4. That said, our focus was primarily on how to innovate upon the original Dark Arisen, so there wasn't any particular game that directly inspired us. In terms of direction, does the hack and slash gameplay lean more toward offering players many different ways to play or toward boosting stats? Kinoshita says our emphasis is on combinations. Equipment comes with randomly assigned custom skills and abilities, and we want players to enjoy replaying content in search of the combinations that suit them best. Expanding that range of playstyles has been a major focus for us. How did the decision to release a Nintendo Switch 2 version come about? Oyama. Actually, the decision to release a Switch 2 version came later on. We initially began the project with the goal of delivering new content to players on existing platforms. During that time, however, we were evaluating the Switch 2 environment for other in-house projects. For instance, recent titles like Resident Evil Requiem and Pragmata demonstrated a high level of compatibility between the RE engine and the Switch 2. Personally, I think that Rise and Sunbreak had already shown that. Those two games are absolutely phenomenal on the original Switch using the RE engine. Some of the best looking games that you have on the Switch are those two, and they actually perform reasonably well. 30 FPS, correct, but those are some solid 30 FPS, not some floaty ass garbage. Unless you're next to Gormagala's Wings. Then things get a little bit different. Gormagala's Wings might need a little bit more optimization. At least last time I played it on the Switch, they definitely needed more optimization. But yeah. That led us to think that Dragon's Dogma 2 might be portable as well, and we decided to take on the challenge. The porting process ended up progressing more smoothly than we had expected, which convinced us that we could release it alongside the expansion. Now, I think that this is actually going to be much more important. Like I said earlier in the video, this is going to be super important, not just for Dragon's Dogma itself, but also for other Capcom titles, because whether or not Dragon's Dogma 2 is able to perform properly on the Nintendo Switch is going to be something that's going to shape the faith in the community as to whether or not Capcom's going to be able to pull off a Monster Hunter Wilds Ascendance. Because Monster Hunter Wilds also had a lot of performance issues, and if Ascendance does not fix those performance issues, then we are going to have a serious problem between the community and Capcom, because people are rightfully very upset at the performance of previous Capcom titles, namely Dragon's Dogma as well as Monster Hunter Wilds. So they better get this right. They definitely need to get this right. So I'm rooting for them, but we'll see. Then they go on to say, were there any particular difficulties that you encountered from that late decision? Oyama says the team has worked incredibly hard. Performance optimization in particular was one of the areas where players had voiced concerns the most when Dragon's Dogma 2 first launched, so that was the first thing we tackled. Alongside work on the Switch 2 version, we went back and revisited countless smaller optimizations and improvements step by step. The Switch 2 supports both handheld and TV play. Do you have any recommendations? Are there any plans to use features like the Joy-Con's mouse mode? I really don't like the Joy-Con's mouse mode. I've never used it. I don't know. I don't like the idea of using a Joy-Con as a mouse, especially because we already have a much superior tracking system in the form of motion tracking. And I know that a lot of people don't want to admit it, but motion tracking is actually really good. Motion tracking is actually the future, and I kind of wish that they would take advantage of that, but they don't. Oyama says, I think players should enjoy the game in whichever style they prefer. We don't currently have plans for features specifically built around the Joy-Con's unique functions. Kind of sucks. I wish they had done at least pointing bows and, anything that you can kind of throw using the motion sensing of Joy-Cons. But then again, the ones from the Wii were way more precise because they used the infrared technology with a little sensor bar thing. Those were like the best when it came to properly aiming. The motion sensing ones that just use the gyros without any IR, those are not as good in my opinion. They're still really good though, and I still really wish more people would support those. So it's a little bit disappointing to know that that's not something that they're implementing, because that technology is just really, really cool, and I wish that more people would work on it. Anyways, they go on to say, after Dark Arisen launches, you plan to continue gathering feedback and introducing major features beyond bug fixes? And Oyama says, at the moment, no. Our goal is to deliver a polished product that players can fully enjoy from day one. So do not expect title updates after the game releases. After Dark Arisen releases, that's it. Dragon's Dogma 2 is complete. Onwards and upwards to other projects is what it seems like. Will feedback you received before launch still influence development? Oyama says, we recently released a hotfix, for example. Those kinds of updates address unforeseen bugs and issues that arise from many interacting systems of an open world game, and we plan to continue rolling out updates like that in the future. So basically, updates, bug fixes, that type of stuff, yes. Additions of content, likely no. Then he goes on to say, so the expansion has fundamentally been built on the feedback you've received so far. Oyama says that's right. That is also why development has taken as much time as it has. Was there any particular player sentiment that ultimately convinced the team to greenlight the project? Oyama says, we received tens of thousands of comments from players, so there wasn't any single piece of feedback that did it for us. We carefully read every response, and among them, the most common sentiment was simply that players wanted more. Yes, correct. Absolutely, we did, because Dragon's Dogma is awesome, and obviously we want more Dragon's Dogma. At some point, we realized that simple title updates wouldn't be enough, and that we wanted to deliver substantial new content such as new stories, action, and monsters that led us to reorganize the development team and launch this new project. Kinoshita goes on to say, more than any individual comment, we strongly felt the palpable collective passion behind messages like, don't let it end here, we believe in you, Capcom. Yeah, there was a lot of hopium for an expansion. My hat's off to everybody that was screaming from the top of their lungs, because I was like, I thought it was done. I thought it was like, okay, Dragon's Dogma 2, we did it. It wasn't as successful as we expected, and it's done. That's kind of like what I thought we were at, but I'm happy that so many people kept going. I wasn't one of them, I'm ashamed to admit. I really thought it was over, so I was like, it is what it is. But, it's good that a lot of you guys kept it going, because having more Dragon's Dogma is something that I will always get behind. That made us feel like we really had to do this properly. Trailer also introduced the Fallen Dragon. What does his presence mean for the Arisen? That's still a secret. We've seen players having fun speculating about it, so for now, we hope everyone looks forward to experiencing the full story. The same goes for the 2 new characters shown alongside it. We hope players will learn more through future announcements and playing the game itself. There were a couple of moments of Dragon's Dogma 2 that made you go, oh! As a longtime fan of the series, should we expect similar callbacks in the expansion? Kinoshita says, I'd love to answer that, but I think everyone's oh moment is probably different, so I'll refrain from saying more. Would you say it would be worth playing the first game beforehand? Kinoshita says, no, I wouldn't go that far. That takes both time and money after all. Personally, I think the first game is still a ton of fun. If you want more Dragon's Dogma and you've only played Dragon's Dogma 2, playing through Dragon's Dogma 1 Dark Arisen can be a ton of fun, so I personally would recommend it, particularly because there's usually so many sales on that, so I don't see why not. But yeah, it's all about whether or not you have the time, especially because 2026 is such a packed schedule. So yeah, I don't know. Oyama says, our basic premise is that this is a game that newcomers can enjoy even as their first entry in the series. Are there any ideas that you couldn't realize in the original Dark Arisen but were finally able to achieve this time? Kinoshita says, as I mentioned earlier, we always wanted the great expansion content set in the open field, and this project finally allowed us to realize that idea. Oyama says, I think the biggest difference is that players can now enjoy hack and slash gameplay within the open field rather than a dungeon. Because the previous one, Bitter Black Isle, was basically just like a progressing dungeon. It's actually interesting to hear Kinoshita talk about how he played a ton of Diablo, because the original Bitter Black Isle kind of is like the first Diablo, because it's just a dungeon, then you just keep going down and lower and deeper into the dungeon. Whereas the same concept of Diablo, you arrive in Tristram and then you just kind of like go down this dungeon until you get to the, lowest point, which is essentially hell. And in a lot of ways, Bitter Black Isle does kind of have that same vibe, which is interesting bit of context that we get from this interview. But yeah. Kinoshita then says, it's not exactly that I had regrets about the original Dark Arisen, but thanks to the technological foundation built for Dragon's Dogma 2, we're able to portray natural elements like snow and wind, much greater detail in the new expansion. Even if you create a northern snow-covered region, it is meaningless if the environment itself doesn't affect gameplay in a significant way. I'm happy that we were able to address that so thoroughly. Thank you very much. And that is the end of the interview. So, more things that I was able to get through some of the other interviews. There is over 150 new weapons and armor that you're going to be able to get. There are no new classes being added, no new jobs or vocations, whatever you want to call them. That was something that we were wondering if maybe they just hadn't announced it yet. No, it's been confirmed that there are no new classes. Pawns will have improved AI, which we had already talked about this one. So that is, stuff like they will be able to tackle you when you're frozen. They'll be able to help you jump higher on top of monsters and stuff like that. This is stuff that we had seen. Potential hard mode. This is something that we talked about in here. But yeah, at this point, we talked about pretty much everything that I got from all the other interviews. Lots of new information, really, really long video. If you stuck around for this long, can I please ask you to hit that like button because it really helps out a lot. Thank you very much for watching. If you guys want more Dragon's Dogma 2 news and updates, make sure to subscribe here on the channel. I'll keep you guys up to date as things happen, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Stay strong, stay safe, peace out.